I've spent the last 3 years investigating cases that exist in the space between what we can prove and what we can explain. Cases where the evidence points in multiple directions at once, where rational explanations crumble under scrutiny, and where the supernatural feels less like possibility and more like the only answer left standing. This isn't about ghost stories told around campfires. This is about real people who died under circumstances that defy every logical framework we have for understanding death. Real investigators who filed reports they couldn't reconcile with their training. Real families left with questions that science refuses to answer. What I'm about to share with you centers on a phenomenon I've come to call the vanishing hour, a specific window of time, always between 2 and 4 a.m., when a series of deaths occurred across the American Midwest between 1998 and 2004. 7 deaths, 7 families, 7 cases that share impossible similarities despite occurring hundreds of miles apart, investigated by different jurisdictions, and involving victims who never knew each other existed. The official explanations vary. Accidental death, misadventure, in one case even suicide. But when you line up the evidence, when you read the autopsy reports side by side, when you listen to what the investigators won't say on record but will tell you after the 3rd drink, you realize something else was happening in those early morning hours. Something that left traces we can measure but cannot name. Let me start where I started, with a case that should have been simple. On March 17, 1998, Sarah Lindholm's body was found in her apartment bathroom in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She was 19 years old, a sophomore at Coe College studying marine biology. The bathtub was full of water. Sarah was discovered submerged, fully clothed, at 6:47 a.m. by her roommate, Jennifer Paulson. The medical examiner's initial assessment was straightforward: accidental drowning. A young woman, possibly intoxicated, fell asleep in the bath, slipped under the water. Tragic, but not mysterious. Except Sarah Lindholm was a competitive swimmer. She'd been swimming since she was 4 years old. She held 2 state records in high school and had trained with Olympic hopefuls the previous summer. The idea that she would accidentally drown in a residential bathtub in less than 18 inches of water was professionally absurd to anyone who knew her capabilities. Jennifer told investigators that she'd gone to bed around midnight. Sarah had been in the living room watching television, completely sober. Jennifer specifically remembered because they'd made plans to go running together at 7 the next morning, and Sarah never drank before an early run. She was disciplined that way, almost obsessive about her training regimen. The apartment door was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of struggle. The bathroom door had been closed but not locked. When Jennifer found her, the water in the tub was still lukewarm. Here's where it gets strange. Sarah was fully dressed. Jeans, a sweatshirt, socks, shoes. Everything. The medical examiner noted this in his report but offered no explanation. People don't casually climb into bathtubs fully clothed. They especially don't do it and then somehow drown. The toxicology report came back clean. No alcohol. No drugs. No sedatives that might explain impaired judgment or loss of consciousness. Her blood work was unremarkable except for one detail that the medical examiner flagged but couldn't interpret. Her cortisol levels were massively elevated, consistent with extreme psychological stress or terror, the kind of hormone spike you see in people who've just survived car crashes or violent attacks. But there was no attack, No visible injuries beyond minor bruising on her knees consistent with kneeling in the tub. Detective Marcus Webb caught the case. I interviewed him in 2019, 21 years after Sarah's death. He's retired now, living in a small town outside Des Moines, and he still keeps the case file in a box in his garage. He pulled it out for me without me even asking, like he'd been waiting for someone to care about the details he'd never been able to forget. The water temperature bothered me, he told me. Jennifer found her at 6:47. The me estimated the time of death between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. That's 3 to 4 hours. The water should have been cold, should have been room temperature, but it wasn't. It was still warm. Not hot, but warm. Like someone had just filled the tub maybe 40 minutes before. I asked him if he thought someone else had been in the apartment. I thought about it. I looked for it. But there was nothing. No evidence anyone else was there. And Jennifer was a light sleeper. That's in her statement. She would have heard someone come in. Would have heard a struggle if Sarah was forced into that tub. Webb paused then, looking out his window at the cornfields stretching into the horizon. There was something else, he said. Something I put in my notes but not in the official report because it sounded crazy. The bathtub wasn't dirty, but when we drained it, there was this residue on the porcelain. Real fine like powder but slightly oily. We sent samples to the lab. They came back inconclusive. Organic matter, they said, but they couldn't identify the source. Could have been anything, they told me. Soap scum, skin cells. But I've seen soap scum and this wasn't it. This was different. It had a smell to it. What kind of smell? Like water that's been sitting stagnant for a long time. Pond water. But there was no way that tub had stagnant water in it. The apartment was clean. Sarah was meticulous. The case was eventually ruled accidental death by drowning. Sarah's parents fought the ruling, hired a private investigator who found nothing new, and eventually gave up. They moved to Arizona 2 years later. Jennifer Paulson transferred schools and, according to Webb, had a breakdown her senior year. She's never spoken publicly about that morning. I would have filed this away as a tragic anomaly, one of those cases where all the pieces don't quite fit but never will. Then I found the second case. James Reilly disappeared on September 3, 2000, from his home in Madison, Wisconsin. He was 42 years old, a high school history teacher, married with 2 teenage daughters. He had no history of mental illness, no financial problems, no indication he was unhappy with his life. By all accounts, James Reilly was content almost aggressively normal. On September 2nd, James and his wife, Patricia, went to bed around 11 p.m. after watching a movie together. Patricia woke at 3:17 a.m. She remembered the time because she checked the clock and realized James wasn't in bed. She assumed he'd gone to the bathroom or gotten water. When he didn't return after 10 minutes, she got up to check on him. He wasn't in the bathroom. I wasn't in the kitchen. She checked the entire house. His car was in the driveway. The doors were locked from the inside. His wallet, keys, and phone were on the nightstand where he always left them. James Reilly had vanished from inside his own home. Patricia called the police at 3:34 a.m. Officers arrived within 15 minutes and conducted a thorough search of the property and surrounding neighborhood. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, no indication of where James might have gone or how he'd left. The next morning, a jogger found James Reilly's body in Forest Hill Cemetery, approximately 2 miles from his home. He was barefoot, wearing only his pajama bottoms. He was lying on his back on top of a grave, arms at his sides, eyes open. The grave belonged to someone named Eleanor Marsh, who had died in 1947. James Reilly had never met Eleanor Marsh, had no connection to her that investigators could establish. The autopsy revealed the cause of death as hypothermia. But here's the problem. It was early September in Wisconsin. The overnight low that night was 64 degrees Fahrenheit. You don't die of hypothermia in 64-degree weather, especially not in a few hours. The human body simply doesn't cool that quickly under those conditions. Yet James Reilly's core body temperature when he was found was 82 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd lost nearly 16 degrees in what could only have been 3 to 4 hours maximum. The medical examiner, Dr. Rachel Chun, noted in her report that the temperature loss was inconsistent with environmental conditions and medically improbable. She recommended further investigation. That investigation never happened. Like Sarah Lindholm, James's toxicology came back clean. No drugs, no alcohol, nothing that would impair his judgment or cause him to wander away from his home in the middle of the night. And like Sarah, his cortisol levels were drastically elevated, indicating severe acute stress. There was one other similarity that nobody noticed at the time because the cases were in different states, handled by different medical examiners who had no reason to compare notes. James Reilly had the same residue on his skin that had been found in Sarah Lindholm's bathtub. I discovered this by accident. I was going through the digital autopsy photos from James's case when I noticed a notation in the file: unidentified organic substance on deceased's feet and lower legs. Samples taken. I requested those lab reports. They described the same oily, powder-like residue. Same inconclusive results. Same vague designation as organic matter of unknown origin. I called Dr. Chun, who's now working in Milwaukee. She remembered the Reilly case immediately. That was the one that made me question whether I knew what I was doing. She told me, "I've been a medical examiner for 30 years. I've seen every kind of death you can imagine. But I have never seen a healthy 42-year-old man die of hypothermia in 60-degree weather. It's not possible." And yet there he was. I asked her about the residue. I remember it because it was unusual. It was on his feet, his ankles, lower legs, like he'd been walking through something. We tested it thoroughly, sent it to 3 different labs. Nobody could tell us what it was. The molecular structure was inconsistent. That was the word they used. Inconsistent. Like it was organic, but not from any known source they could identify. Did you ever hear about a similar case in Iowa? The girl who drowned in her bathtub in 1998. There was a long silence on the phone. "No," she said finally. "Should I have?" I started building a database. Every suspicious death in the Midwest between 1995 and 2005 that occurred in the early morning hours. Every case with unexplained elements. Every autopsy that flagged something unusual without providing answers. What I found was 7 cases that shared specific, impossible-to-ignore characteristics. Time of death: always between 2 and 4 a.m. Elevated cortisol levels indicating extreme stress. Clean toxicology reports. The presence of the unidentified organic residue. circumstances that defied normal explanation. Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Madison, Wisconsin. Rockford, Illinois. Springfield, Missouri. Fort Wayne, Indiana. Omaha, Nebraska. Sioux Falls, South Dakota. 7 cities. 7 deaths. 7 people who had no connection to each other, who lived hundreds of miles apart, who died years apart, but who all shared these exact same markers. The third case was Brian Costello, who died in Rockford, Illinois, in June 1999. Brian was a 36-year-old construction foreman. He was found dead in his truck in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner at 4:42 a.m. by the overnight cook who was taking out the trash. Brian had apparently been sitting in his truck in the parking lot for hours. The cook, Marcus Johnson, told police he'd seen the truck when he arrived for his shift at 10 p.m., but assumed someone was sleeping it off. When the truck was still there at dawn, he went to check. Brian was sitting upright in the driver's seat, engine off, keys in his lap. He was dead. His eyes were open. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the medical examiner noted significant force was required to reposition the fingers post-mortem. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Brian Costello had no history of heart problems. He was in excellent physical condition. His last physical 3 months earlier had shown perfect cardiovascular health. The cardiac arrest was real, his heart had stopped. But Dr. Leonard Hayes, the medical examiner, couldn't determine what caused it. There was no blockage, no arrhythmia, no structural defect. Brian's heart had simply stopped beating. His cortisol levels were once again massively elevated. And when they processed his truck, they found the residue on the driver's seat, the steering wheel, and the floor mats. What made Brian's case particularly disturbing was what the overnight cook reported to police, a detail that was buried in the initial incident report and never followed up on. Marcus Johnson told Officer Andrea Simmons that when he'd approached the truck to check on the driver, he'd seen something moving inside the vehicle. Not Brian. Brian was completely still, but something else. Like shadows, Marcus said. But they weren't normal shadows. They were moving wrong, moving against the light from the diner sign. Officer Simmons wrote this down but noted in her report that Marcus appeared extremely sleep-deprived and may have been experiencing visual disturbances. She didn't ask follow-up questions. I tracked down Marcus Johnson in 2020. He'd quit the diner 2 weeks after Brian Costello died and moved to Tennessee to live with his sister. He works in a warehouse now and doesn't like talking about that night. I know what I saw, he told me over the phone. I don't care if she thought I was tired or crazy or whatever. Those shadows in that truck weren't right. They were moving like they had weight to them, like they were alive. And when I got close enough to see Brian's face, to see that he was dead with his eyes open and his hands locked on that wheel, I knew something had been in there with him. Something that wasn't there anymore when I opened the door, but had been there right before. What do you think it was? I don't think anything, man. I know what it felt like. Felt like something had just left. Like I'd missed it by seconds. And whatever it was, it had killed that guy. Detective Webb in Iowa. Dr. Chun in Wisconsin. Dr. Hayes in Illinois. 3 professionals who worked 3 separate cases in 3 separate states, and when I brought them together on a conference call in late 2020, they all said the same thing. These deaths don't make sense within the framework of known medical and investigative science. If these were the only weird cases we'd ever seen, that would be one thing, Dr. Hayes said. But they're not. We all see cases that don't quite add up. But these are different. These have consistency. And consistency means pattern. And pattern means something is causing them. I asked what he thought that something was. I'm a scientist, he said. I deal in evidence. And the evidence says these people died from physiological responses to extreme stress. Their bodies essentially shut down from terror or trauma. But there's no external source for that terror. No attacker, no accident, no medical event. So either something happened that we have no framework for understanding, or... He didn't finish the sentence. Dr. Chin did. Or we're dealing with something that exists outside our current scientific understanding. Something that leaves organic residue we can't identify. Something that causes death in ways that mimic natural causes but aren't. Something that operates in that window of time when the human mind is most vulnerable, between deep sleep and waking, between 2 and 4 a.m. when our circadian rhythms are at their lowest point. Webb, the detective, laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. You're talking about something supernatural, he said. And the minute we put that in a report, we lose all credibility. The cases get closed. The families get no answers. And whatever this thing is, it keeps happening. He was right. After Brian Costello in 1999, there was Rachel Morrison in 2001, Thomas Brennan in 2002, Michelle Cross in 2003, and finally David Weston in 2004. Each case followed the same pattern. Each victim died between 2 and 4 a.m. Each showed elevated cortisol. Each had the residue. And each died in a way that was technically explainable but practically impossible. Rachel Morrison, a 28-year-old nurse from Fort Wayne, Indiana, was found dead in the hospital where she worked, in a locked supply closet on the 3rd floor. She'd been strangled, but there were no ligature marks, no signs of manual strangulation, no evidence of anyone else being in that closet. The medical examiner determined that her hyoid bone was fractured and her trachea crushed, consistent with strangulation, but couldn't explain how it had happened without any external pressure marks on her throat. Thomas Brennan, a 54-year-old accountant from Omaha, Nebraska, fell to his death from his 2nd-story bedroom window. Except the window was closed and locked from the inside when his wife found his body in the backyard at dawn. The glass was intact. There was no possible way he'd gone through that window without breaking it. Michelle Cross, a 33-year-old elementary school teacher from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, died from what the medical examiner called catastrophic internal trauma, consistent with being crushed or compressed with extreme force. She was found in her bed, undisturbed, with no external injuries whatsoever. Her internal organs had been ruptured, her ribs fractured in multiple places, but her skin showed no bruising, no marks, nothing to indicate what had applied that force. And David Weston, a 19-year-old college student from Springfield, Missouri, the final case in 2004, was found drowned in his dorm room sink. The sink basin was 11 inches deep. David Weston was 6 feet 2 inches tall. There is no possible way a grown man drowns face down in an 11-inch sink basin unless he's being held down. His roommate was asleep 8 feet away. Heard nothing. I saw nothing. Woke up at 7 a.m. to find David slumped over the sink, his face submerged in water that had somehow stayed in the basin for hours without draining. I spent 3 years on this. 3 years interviewing investigators, medical examiners, family members. 3 years reading autopsy reports and crime scene photos. 3 years trying to find a rational explanation that accounts for all of the evidence. I don't have one. What I have instead is a theory that sounds insane but is the only framework that fits all of the facts. Something was hunting these people. Not a person. Not a serial killer in the traditional sense. But something that moved between locations, that operated in that specific window of time, that left behind traces our laboratories can detect but can't identify. Something that caused death through terror so profound that it triggered catastrophic physiological responses. The residue is the key. It appeared in every case. The same molecular structure or lack thereof. The same oily, powder-like consistency. The same smell of stagnant water. I sent samples from 3 different cases to a friend who works in molecular biology at Northwestern. She's a serious scientist, not someone given to wild speculation. When she called me back 2 weeks later, she sounded shaken. "I can't tell you what this is," she said. "I can tell you what it's not. It's not bacterial, not fungal, not plant matter, not animal tissue. The molecular structure is, I don't know how to explain this. It's organic, but it doesn't follow any known organic patterns. It's like it's alive and not alive at the same time. Like it exists in some intermediate state. What does that mean? It means I don't know. It means this shouldn't exist. And it definitely shouldn't be appearing at multiple crime scenes hundreds of miles apart over a period of years." She asked me not to send her any more samples. The 2 to 4 a.m. window is significant for another reason beyond circadian rhythms. In folklore and religious traditions across cultures, this period is known as the Devil's Hour or the Witching Hour. It's the time when the barrier between our world and something else is supposedly at its thinnest, when spirits can cross over, when things that shouldn't exist can manifest. I'm not a superstitious person. I wasn't raised religious. I've spent my entire adult life believing that everything has a rational explanation if you look hard enough. But I've looked, and the rational explanations don't work. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The cases stopped in 2004. David Weston was the last. After his death in October 2004, there were no more cases that fit the pattern.
Eva searched exhaustively.
No more deaths between 2 and 4 a.m. with the specific markers. No more unidentified residue. No more impossible circumstances. Either whatever was causing these deaths stopped or it moved. I spent 6 months expanding my search geographically. Checked cases in other parts of the country. Found nothing. Then I went international. Started looking at similar cases in Canada, Mexico, Europe, and I found something. Between 2006 and 2011, there was a cluster of unexplained deaths in rural Scotland. 5 cases, all between 2 and 4 a.m., all with elevated cortisol. All ruled accidental or natural despite circumstances that didn't quite add up. The Scottish authorities hadn't tested for the residue. They had no reason to. But when I contacted the pathologist who'd handled 3 of the cases and described what to look for, she went back through her archived samples. It was there. The same unidentified organic substance. The same molecular inconsistency. After Scotland, there was a gap. Then in 2014, 3 cases in rural Japan. In 2017, 4 cases in Argentina. Always rural areas. Always small towns. Always that same window of time, those same impossible circumstances. It's moving. Every few years it appears somewhere new, takes 7 to 10 victims, then vanishes again. And here's what terrifies me. The pattern suggests it's cyclical. The geographic jumps aren't random. They follow ley lines, ancient pathways that believers in the paranormal claim are channels of Earth energy. I know how that sounds. I know how I sound even when I say it. But when you map the cases on a globe and overlay known ley line maps, they align. The Midwest cluster from 1998 to 2004 sits on what's called the St. Lawrence ley line. The Scottish cases align with the Edinburgh Stonehenge line. Japan, Argentina, they all correspond to documented ley line intersections. If the pattern holds, if this thing operates on some kind of geographic and temporal cycle, then it should appear again soon. Somewhere along one of these lines. Somewhere rural, somewhere quiet. Somewhere people won't immediately connect isolated deaths across multiple jurisdictions. I've been monitoring death records in areas that fit the profile. Small towns along ley lines. Populations under 50,000. I've set up news alerts for unexplained deaths. I've reached out to medical examiners and small-town police departments with a questionnaire that asks about specific markers without revealing why I'm asking. 3 weeks ago, I got a response from a sheriff's deputy in rural Montana, a town called Elkridge, population 6,000. They'd found a body 2 weeks earlier. A local ranch hand named Christopher Lake, 29 years old, found dead in his truck at 4:30 a.m. by his brother who'd come to pick him up for work. Cause of death was listed as acute heart failure. No prior heart condition. Clean toxicology. And according to the deputy, who'd been at the scene, there was some kind of weird residue in the truck that they'd bagged as evidence but hadn't been able to identify. I asked what time Christopher died. Me says between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. The deputy told me. I asked if they'd tested his cortisol levels. There was a pause. How'd you know about that? Yeah, they were really high. Me said it was weird, but sometimes happens with sudden cardiac death. I'm on a plane to Montana tomorrow. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I've constructed an elaborate theory from coincidence. That I've found patterns where none exist because the human brain is wired to find patterns, even in randomness. That the cases I've identified are tragic but ultimately explainable within the bounds of known science. And I'm just refusing to accept those explanations because I want there to be a mystery. You might be right. But let me tell you about the families. Sarah Lindholm's mother, Janet, never recovered from her daughter's death. She spent years insisting that something had been in that apartment with Sarah that night. Something that her daughter had encountered in the bathroom. She had no evidence, no way to prove it. Just a mother's certainty that her Olympic-caliber swimmer daughter hadn't accidentally drowned in a bathtub. Janet started having nightmares 6 months after Sarah died. Always the same dream. She's standing outside Sarah's apartment building at night, looking up at the bathroom window, and she can see shadows moving inside, pressing against the glass. Not one shadow. Multiple shadows, layered over each other, moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. She told me this during our interview, crying. I know it sounds crazy, she said. I know you probably think I'm just a grieving mother who can't accept what happened, but those dreams felt real. They felt like memories, like some part of me knew something had been there, and my subconscious was trying to tell me. Patricia Reilly, James's widow, told me something similar. After her husband vanished from their locked house and was found dead from impossible hypothermia, she started sensing things in their bedroom. Presence, she called them. Like the air was thicker in certain spots. Like something was occupying space even though I couldn't see it. She had the house blessed by a priest. It didn't help. Eventually, she moved out. She lives in an apartment now, all the lights on all the time, even when she's sleeping. Brian Costello's sister, Jennifer, refused to talk to me at first. But after I sent her the information about the other cases, she called me back. She told me that Brian had called her 3 nights before he died. It was unusual, they were close, but they usually texted rather than called. He'd sounded strange, she said, distracted. He told her he'd been having a recurring experience over the past week where he'd wake up around 3 a.m., feeling like someone was standing at the foot of his bed. He'd turn on the light and no one would be there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. He laughed about it, Jennifer said. He told me he must be getting old, getting spooked by nothing, but I could hear it in his voice. He was scared, actually scared, and Brian didn't scare easily. 3 nights later, he was dead in his truck, hands locked on the steering wheel, eyes open, heart stopped by nothing that could be medically identified. The more I've researched, the more I've found a strange commonality among the victims. They all reported unusual experiences in the days or weeks before they died. Sensing presence, waking at odd hours, feeling watched. These weren't public reports, they were things mentioned to family members, friends, colleagues. Small comments that seemed insignificant at the time but take on terrible weight in retrospect. Rachel Morrison, the nurse who was strangled in a locked closet, had told a coworker that she kept hearing footsteps on the hospital's 3rd floor during her night shifts. Footsteps in hallways she knew were empty. She'd even filed a maintenance request, thinking there might be animals in the walls. The maintenance report found nothing. Thomas Brennan, who somehow fell from a locked 2nd-story window, had installed new locks on all his windows 2 weeks before his death. When his wife asked why, he said he felt like someone had been trying to get into the house at night. He had no evidence, just a feeling. Michelle Cross, who died of catastrophic internal trauma with no external injuries, had written in her journal about bad dreams where I can't breathe, where something heavy is sitting on my chest, pressing down. Her journal was found by her sister when they were cleaning out her apartment. She'd been having these dreams for 3 weeks before she died. It's like they were being stalked, observed, selected. And here's the most disturbing part. In 3 of the cases, the victims had recently been to the same type of location, places associated with death and burial. Sarah Lindholm had visited a flooded cemetery with friends 2 weeks before her death. It was part of a photography project for one of her classes. James Reilly had chaperoned a field trip to a historical cemetery with his history students 10 days before he vanished. Brian Costello had attended his uncle's funeral at a cemetery in rural Illinois 5 days before his cardiac arrest. I don't know if this means anything. Cemeteries are common places. People visit them for all sorts of reasons. But the timing feels significant. Like maybe they'd encountered something at those locations. Like maybe they'd been noticed. There's a concept in folklore called psychopomps, entities that guide souls between the world of the living and the dead. But there are also stories of corrupted psychopomps, things that don't guide, things that hunt, that feeds on the transition between life and death, that exists in liminal spaces and times, like the hours between 2 and 4 a.m. when the body's defenses are lowest. I'm not saying I believe this. I'm saying it's the only framework I've found that accommodates all of the evidence. If you're listening to this and you've experienced any of the following in the past few weeks, I need you to take it seriously. Waking repeatedly between 2 and 4 a.m. for no apparent reason. Sensing presence in your home when you're alone. Finding unexplained residue or dampness in areas of your house, particularly bathrooms or bedrooms. Feeling like you're being watched during late-night hours. Having dreams of shadows that move wrong, that press against surfaces, that seem aware of you. These were all reported by victims or their families. These were all warnings that went unheeded because they seemed too vague, too easily dismissed as stress or imagination. If you've visited a cemetery recently, particularly an old one or one in a state of disrepair, pay attention to how you feel in the following weeks. Pay attention to your sleep patterns. Pay attention to any sense that something followed you home. I know this sounds like the advice of someone who's lost perspective, who's seen too many crime scene photos and read too many autopsy reports and has started believing in monsters. Maybe that's what I am now. Maybe that's what this investigation has turned me into. But I've also seen the evidence. I've talked to the investigators who worked these cases, who are trained skeptics, who've seen the worst of human behavior and know the difference between murder and something else. And they believe something happened to these people. Something outside the normal bounds of what we call possible. Detective Webb told me, near the end of our last conversation, I've worked homicides for 30 years. I've seen people killed in every way you can imagine. But I've never felt what I felt when I stood in Sarah Lindholm's bathroom and looked at that tub. I've never felt that kind of wrongness. Like the space itself was contaminated with something that didn't belong in our world. Dr. Chun, the medical examiner in Wisconsin, said, I can't prove anything supernatural happened to James Reilly, but I also can't explain his death using any medical knowledge I have. And after 30 years in this field, that terrifies me, because it means there are ways to die that we haven't documented, causes of death that science hasn't named. I'm in Montana now. I arrived in Elkridge 3 days ago. I've examined Christopher Lake's autopsy report. I've photographed the residue samples that the sheriff's department collected from his truck. I've interviewed his brother who found him. The markers are all there. The impossible death, the elevated cortisol, the residue. The time of death is between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. And yesterday, the sheriff's department called me because there's been another death. A woman named Melissa Torres, 31 years old, found dead in her home at dawn by her husband. She's in the morgue now. They're doing the autopsy today. I asked what time she died. Somewhere around 3 a.m. The deputy told me. Can't be more specific than that. I asked if they'd found any unusual residue at the scene. There was a long pause. How'd you know about that? Yeah, there was something on her bedroom floor. Oily stuff. We're having it tested. 2 deaths in 3 weeks. Both fitting the pattern. Both in the same small Montana town. It's here. It's active. And if the historical pattern holds, there will be more. 5 to 8 more victims over the next 2 to 4 years. Then it will move again, appearing somewhere else along its incomprehensible route. I've contacted the local authorities. I've shown them my research. I've explained the pattern. They're listening, which is more than I expected, but they don't know what to do with the information. How do you protect people from something you can't see, can't predict, can't even prove exists? How do you warn a community that something is hunting them when you have no rational explanation for what that something is? The sheriff, a man named Robert Canfield, looked at me across his desk yesterday and said, "What am I supposed to tell people? Lock your doors between 2 and 4 a.m.? Don't go to sleep? Stay away from..." What location am I supposed to tell them to avoid? What precautions would even matter against something like this? He's right. I have no useful advice to give. I have data and patterns and theories that sound insane when spoken aloud. I have 7 years of deaths across the Midwest, 5 in Scotland, 3 in Japan, 4 in Argentina, and now 2 in